Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second community call of 2022. I'm here with Claire Eccleston, a midwife and a magical healer woman who, we've moved in similar circles for many, many years, but haven't had an opportunity to have a conversation yet. So I'm super excited to be with you today in this space. So, would you love to introduce yourself, my dear?
Kia ora, Sama. It's a real honor to be here. Um, so kia ora koutou ngā mihi ko Claire Eccleston tōku ingoa. My roots are deeply convict. I'm from Australia. My ancestry is like the weeds that grow through the cement, which is something actually I'm really proud of. And prior to that, my ancestry is Irish. And my mother was a midwife, and my nanny had 8 children. And we moved over 17 years ago to Aotearoa so I could train and work as a home birth midwife over here. So currently I offer home birth midwifery, and I'm a spinning babies approved trainer. And I do a stream, which is scar tissue remediation and management. So internal work with women, and very similar to holistic pelvic care. And I'm also a craniosacral therapist, and I'm a grandma and a mama.
Oh my gosh. There's so much just in that introduction I want to dive into. The two things that are coming really strongly is a lineage. And so when you say my mother was a midwife as well, and my grandmother had 8 children, my grandmother had 13. And yeah, so we'll talk about that more later. But just this, like, the deep rooted knowing of what you come from, and the sweet, beautiful way of, like, I'm so proud of my heritage, whatever that is. I think that there's such a permission there for people of any background to heal beyond a lot of the fractures we live in. So I'm so grateful for that. And then also, when you were speaking, just this like overwhelming wave of there's going to be people all over the world who need to speak with you, because the postpartum healing phase, and I know you've shared, like, you have some trainings, holy ground, I think you called it, around vaginal repair. I feel like this is a giant space that is still taboo,
Mm.
that is still so ridden with shame and
Mm.
so lonely. And so
Mm.
I think I've jumped to like 12 steps ahead, but that's what was coming. So maybe just parsing out that thread of lineage and that thread of repair and how they intersect. What's stirring for you?
Mm. Yeah, I absolutely agree that, if we talk about yonis or vaginas or vulvas, there tends to be so much silence around it. They are these dark, warm, quiet places. But I think particularly after birth, there's a lot of silence about um, prolapse and incontinence, or I'm doing a new course around pleasure and lovemaking after birth. And that can be if you've had a baby 10 years ago. And, it was like the clitoris was only properly mapped in 2005, like our anatomy has been silenced. And I think there's so much exquisite power in our pleasure, in our wombs, in our yonis, in our pelvic space, in the base. And when I think of my lineage, when I think of, I think often of the women of my lineage. And the other day I was driving in the car and I was like, I had just done 5 rhythms dance, and I danced like a wild animal. And I felt so animal and so earthy. And I was like, oh, I love being a woman. I love the um, power of being a woman. And for me, a lot of that power feels like it's in deep interrelationship with my capacity for pleasure. And I love that you're inviting and that you're opening dialogue for there to be dialogue around these places that are often silenced. And it feels, I agree, like taboo, or like, it's interesting. It often feels to me, particularly with scar tissue remediation, it's not something that people have heard about. It's quite pioneering work, and yet it's so ancient that the way women feel, or people with vulvas feel about their bodies, I think it's just not being given a language, and it's not being given a voice for people even to be able to articulate it or to communicate it or to identify it.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
yeah, pardon.
I got excited. Go ahead.
No, please, you go.
There was just the tiniest delay. I could hear you and I thought you stopped, but thank you, thank you. I didn't want to interrupt your train of thought. I think, when you're speaking about five rhythms and you're speaking about scar tissue remediation and you're speaking about the spaces where there hasn't been movement and movement has seized and there's been a freezing and a frozenness, I think I teach Koya, which is as a dance movement therapy experience. And so often, and I love the piece you brought in about lovemaking postpartum, whatever that looks like and feels like in whatever timeline that is. Because so often in a movement space, and it is primarily women, but it's everybody, but people who come into that space, people who've birthed, no matter how much time has gone by, like to be able to move in whatever capacity they move, it's like the body knows no time.
Mm,
And it waits until there's an opportunity to tell the truth.
mm,
And so much of this is about like stories that don't get told. So I'm
mm.
curious what stirs for you there.
I love the way that you're interpreting and hearing what I'm saying and where that leads to. I think for me, movement equates health on so many levels. Like if I'm at a birth, I know the birth is going well when there's movement, even if it's slow movement. Like when there's not movement in birth, that's where either there's a place for our loving attention or where we need to bring in other attention. So movement is health. And as a craniosacral therapist, it's like when the body moves, when there's blood flow, when there's fascial glide, when the nerves are connecting, movement is health. And then in scar tissue as well, movement is health, because say if you've got scar tissue in, say, your vulva or vagina and it's impeding blood flow, that can impede engorgement, and then that can impede lubrication. And when I think, and earlier we were talking about, this sense of sovereignty and how do we feel powerful in our own bodies? And one of my sort of ways that I do is, how do I move? Where do I move? How do I keep my breath moving? How do I keep my emotions moving so I don't get stuck? Like, as I was saying, I'm day 21 of my period cycle. I was really grumpy this morning. And if I went into that, I could get really stuck. I wouldn't feel like I was in my vitality. So I like punched some pillows and did an angry dance. So it's referring to movement as health. So I love that you're bringing Koya about that. And in times when we're feeling disempowered, either by our external or by our internal, perhaps a question or an invitation that I ask myself is, where do I find movement within this? Because once there's movement, then there's health, and then there's also power.
Oh, so powerful. And again, I love the dance of energy between us, because it's like I'll hear something in what you're saying, and then we'll go off to the next thing. So what I felt and heard in what you were saying is also sensitivity, and the one of the things I'm most amazed by in the world is how much the world around us is working to desensitize us, and how required an awakening of sensitivity, whether that's on a physical, energetic, emotional, mental, interpersonal, cosmic level, is required for these very natural transitions and initiations that a human being goes through, and birth being one of the most profound. But what you can't feel, you can't do anything about, and so it's super, super interesting to me. And I'm a highly sensitive person, like crazy, like can't sleep if the Wi-Fi is on, can't do, like every little thing is major. And so I've come to understand that's my gift and one of the biggest liabilities living in this world, where people are consistently having parts of themselves switched off in order to cope.
Mm.
And I think the place that you maybe would see that the most is in the birthing arena, but then also in the vaginal space. consistently. And so this would relate to scarring. So I'm curious what comes up around sensitivity.
Such gorgeous conversation. Yeah, I think it's I think there's one thing to, it's like how we need to be sensitive to be empathetic, but do we numb our own sensitivity to cope? So for me, it's like, yes, there needs to be sensitivity so we can feel and relate and care. But actually, to survive with sensitivity, for me, there needs to be the base. There needs to be the grounding. There needs to be the solid space of a midline. And I find I'm also really super sensitive. Like if I'm on a bus, I can feel what's going on for everyone on the bus. And it was so challenging to survive that. But what has really helped me more and more is the deeper I drop into my own base, in terms of, even being aware of the anus or being aware of my vagina or being aware of the power of my pelvis. The deeper I drop in and claim my own sense of midline, the more I'm able to be aware of everything that's going on and still sensitive but unaffected. So it's the balance of both. And like we are so born with everything we need. Like when we're an embryo, again, craniosacral, we start from a dot and then we become a pole, and that pole becomes our midline, our spine, our blood midline, our or for me, often I feel like a conduit, like between heaven and earth, that midline of the body. And with the sense of midline and sense of base, I find I can be as sensitive and it's more manageable. So it's one thing to open our sensitivity, perhaps, and then another, how to survive being that sensitive, and that the power that sits in our base. For me, anyway, that's something that's helped me survive my own sensitivity and manage it. Like I went to a fruit shop recently and I could feel everybody, and I started to get overwhelmed. And then I could come in when I came into my base, and I'm like, okay, I feel you're having some stress with money. I feel your child is crying. I hear you're stressed with your baby. I can feel the plants outside need a bit of a water. And then it was more manageable. So that's something, that's how I cope. It's that balance and the acknowledgement of there's more power in our yonis, in our vaginas, in our anuses, in our base than just pleasure, and then just the physicality of it. It's the power of grounding as well.
Yeah, so when you're speaking, what's really hitting me deeply is one of the deepest tenets of the feminine, and including all humans in this now, like whatever feminine, whether you're a woman, whether you are holding the feminine in some other way, one of the deepest tenets of the feminine is its ability to sense the community constantly
Mm-hmm.
and to consistently scan and check and make sure that everything is working well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that it feels like something that's overwhelming, and I think that's a function of this time. My I've shared this before, but my dad comes from a very tribal society. My mother does too, but they're one generation away. And you can see in their nervous systems the lack of interruption
Mm-hmm.
to just being able to feel what's happening. Like my dad in particular um, woke up one night when I was a very small baby. This is the story I've been told, and a pillow was on my face, and he's the one who woke up because he sensed it. And then I was maybe 2 or 3 and about to go flying off the railing of like a very high second-story building, and he just sat bolt upright and ran out of the room and grabbed me by my diaper and pulled me off. And
Mm-hmm.
it's a nervous system thing, it's a psychic thing, it's a community thing. And I think it's actually our species, like it's our imperative, is to feel each other. And so it's interesting we're on this forum, right? And one of the things that's been so cool since teaching a lot more online is realizing that this space can also be the same space. Like we're teaching from the third eye. You're not actually teaching in a disembodied way. You have to feel the energy of the group all the time. And so, what can you offer people? Like, you said connect with the root, drop in, feel your yoni, feel your anus, feel the pelvic floor, feel the uterus, feel everything. And I think there's some people who that's like quite hard to wrap their heads around, because there might be emotional things in the way of being that deeply anchored into our physical experience. Is there anything that comes up around that?
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. I love hearing those stories of your dad, and what it makes me think of is how much he must have been in his body, in his animal body, in that sense. And, coming back to that idea of sensitivity and sort of fine tuning the radio, what's the sensitivity of our animal bodies? And I think, like, if we look at our disconnect from our pelvis, or our disconnect from our legs, and our disconnect from the earth, to bring it back to a really pragmatic way of talking about it, even if you look at perhaps how, just to generalize, how people in South America might move their hips, how they might move through space, or how people in Africa might move their hips. I don't know if you've read the book In My Grandmother's Hands, and he talks about this white body trauma and black body trauma, and how the way our fascia, the stuff that sort of helps our organs glide and it's around our muscles, there's these fascial memories, but there can also be fascial restrictions, either from our ancestry or from our culture, so that there's almost prescribed movement patterns. Like if I was standing in the queue at Countdown and I start like hip thrusting, I am breaking the rules about movement that's acceptable in our culture. So when I talk about that disconnect, it can be as simple as, if you just, or if you're listening, if you take a breath for a moment and you feel your breath in, and as you breathe out, just noticing how much depth does your breath drop into through your body. Do you feel your breath in your throat? Can you feel your out breath in your heart? Can you feel your out breath in your belly, upper belly? Can you feel your out breath in your lower belly? And then what would it be like, or could it be like, if your out breath comes right down into the bones of your pelvis? Or if your out breath came right down out through your genitals and through the base, and how might that feel? And just noticing, if you, and if you can't do that, be so deeply self-compassionate. It's just a awareness exercise. If you just notice your breath is in your chest, that's super okay. But often if your breath can come right down into the base, you may even notice your throat open some more, or your shoulders drop. So on a really pragmatic level and a physical, practical level, it's looking at having that awareness of, how do you inhibit your body, or where do you inhibit your body, and what comes up for you. Like, I know for myself, there's a lot of shame that sits in my base, or in movements with my pelvis that I've had to work through, that is culturally prescribed. Something is happening to my phone. And it's ancestrally present. And there's a lot of experiences that women and people move through around their base and their pelvis that can be there. And sometimes they're tucked away, those stories or those experiences, as a necessary place of functioning. And that's why sometimes within movement, or within touch or conscious awareness, if there's an opportunity for those stories or experiences to be heard, to be deeply compassionately acknowledged, sometimes the consequence of that is the capacity for more movement. And it's not like you might do like amazing hip circles, but within movement, it might be even the slightest micro movements that allow for more aliveness, that allow for more reclamation. Does that make
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It really makes sense. And there's so many things I want to ask and speak to in what you've shared. And I went very deep in your guided journey with the breath. So I'm trying to come back into my conscious mind. But the
well,
first
we could just
thing,
speak from there, right?
I don't think I can speak from there. I think I'll just start floating away. So the first thing that really struck me that was so healing and so profound. So I just need to preface this slightly. So I've shared in this forum, and some of you may know, and I don't know if you know Claire, but Mount Albert, Owairaka, we've been protecting the trees for the last 2 and a bit years. And there's this amazing conflict, this amazing internal thing that's come up in society that I've been like this close to since 2019. And that's like how to be in this idea of what is called decolonization in a compassionate way. How not to just fight like a wounded fire with a wounded fire. And so when you were guiding me through that space, and when you spoke to inherited cultural ancestral patterns of tension and limitation, the thing that hit me the most, and one of the things I'm really deeply passionate about, is that every single human being has an ancestry and an indigenosity that they can link back to. And the interruptions for some of us happened a very long time ago. And I think you're saying the same thing in a different way. And my curiosity with that, and I'm trying to find the right words, is when you're not allowed to thrust your hips at Countdown, which is a supermarket here for those who are not here, when you walk in and you can feel like 10 generations of holding, and whatever your background is, what else has a community been forced to do when they've cut off from that place, like the lower heart and the upper heart? Like if you want to create civilizations of warriors or people who can take someone else's land or hurt their children or do these things, whatever, and this happened all over the world. It's not one, I'm not talking about one group. You have to cut people off from their hearts and their womb space and their pelvic space. You have to, because that place is like where love and compassion come from. Pleasure and love to me are very interlaced, overlapping experiences. And so when you say I'm doing an ancestral reclamation by thrusting my hips at the supermarket, I think there's a lot of grief that you're speaking to as well. I'm curious what's coming up for you.
Yeah, I don't myself, I don't experience it so much as grief. I've experienced it as this like this re-reclamation. I don't know if you're aware, and I can't remember where I read it from, but I read something once, and I'm sorry if I'm paraphrasing really incorrectly. And it was something like, in the time of the Second World War and the Nazis, there was one of the advisors, and he said something like, you need to separate people from their pleasure, because if people are separated from their pleasure, they're separated from their bodies. And if they're separated from their bodies, they will obey. They're more likely to obey. So I suppose my sense of, if I start to reclaim the pleasure of my body, the power of my body, I also start to reclaim my sovereignty and my independence as a human, if that makes sense. And
Go ahead.
yeah. And I suppose, though, perhaps it's two different things. And I absolutely see my body as earth and as part of earth. And also I'm aware of, I'm a white Australian woman living in Aotearoa, and there are different relationships. As a white Australian woman, I had a lot of shame around, how dare I connect with this land that my ancestors have colonized, and where is my sense of place, and where is my turanga waiwai, where do I plant my feet? So there's a few layers, perhaps. For me, it feels quite your question is quite rich, and I'm not quite sure how to respond, other than I know as a body that I come from this earth, and I connect deeply in, and then also with the responsibility of a white woman and knowing what and how my ancestors are. There's a need I have to fully take responsibility and reclaim how I can be deeply respectful to Indigenous people, or tangata whenua. So that for me, it's like quite multi-layered, the answer. I'm not quite sure how to answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's super powerful. It's an exploration, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think there's an opportunity for greater and greater compassion.
Mm.
You know, like I really see repeatedly how my skin color and my tribal ancestries allow me to have certain conversations
Mm.
that other people can't have so easily.
Mm.
And at the same time, it's like there's the holding, as you're saying, of the incredible ancestral pain of so many people, and the reality of our humanness. And
Mm.
it's like almost a dual awareness of like they have to go hand in hand if we want to go anywhere new, I guess is what I'm saying. And I have many, so grateful for so many amazing teachers who come from many different backgrounds around the world, who are elders, who kind of echo the same thing, is that our future has to be together. And so this time feels like the shadow work of parsing out, you know, the pain and the separation and the horrible harm and the projections and all these things. And I guess this conversation is touching the place where it happens in our bodies.
Mm.
Like it ultimately it
Yeah.
does.
Yeah. And thank you. Thanks. I'm reflecting as you're talking, and I think, within my journey as a white Australian woman, what I have had to take responsibility for is, to be crass about it, is perpetrator energy, because my ancestors perpetrated, they colonized. Uh, and then I have to also, in my body, how do I take responsibility, particularly if I bring it back into the base? The base is pleasure, but within the base there's also rage, there's also capacity for perpetration, there's also capacity for destruction. And I think for me to fully be able to be in allyship or to be helpful to those that are colonized, I have to deeply take responsibility for where I colonize, for where I take advantage of my white privilege, and see how that affects others, and attempt and intend not to do it, and also use my privilege to bring about equality if there's not. And then if I bring it into my body, it's if I can only be in my base if I fully accept everything that's there. Where do I destroy? Where do I perpetrate? Where is my rage healthy and where is it unhealthy? Because if I just come in with a sense of I'm just so pleasurable, actually I'm missing 3/4 or a half of the reality of this body. And if I'm afraid of my own rage, or if I'm afraid of my own capacity for destruction, then I also can't come deeply into my own body, into that animal body, animalness. Like animals destroy, mostly they have to eat. Animals in their wild, if I'm afraid of my own wild, I can't fully claim this physicality that I live in. And I think it takes a lot of courage to acknowledge when we have been transgressed. It also takes a lot of courage to acknowledge when we transgress, that to come into real power, we have to acknowledge both in ourselves.
Yeah.
And
It's the journey of wholeness,
mm,
individually and collectively
mm,
and as a species.
mm,
And it's all these pieces that are being rearranged at this time because we face a much greater threat and opportunity for healing in what we've done to our world. And so there was a couple of things that were so powerful, and I really appreciate the vulnerability and the sensitivity and diving into this on an identity level because, you know, I just see a human being sitting in front of me, and you're naming all the things that others might see or feel as well, and what you've had to parse out in yourself to actually come to the wholeness of you, which all of us do in different ways. I'm reminded of the book The Smell of Rain on Dust by Martin Prechtel.
I haven't read that
Probably
one.
saying his name wrong. But there's an amazing passage, and the book's really about grief. And that was, I think, the reason I looped back into that question about when you're thrusting your hips at the supermarket, is the ancestral grief there? And what I was sensing is, you know, whoever in this the colonizer colonized dynamic, everybody lost something for that dance to happen.
Mm,
And it's like, you know, when you dive into that piece, it's not saying the losses are of the same weight, but
mm,
every loss is a loss.
mm,
And so he spoke about this amazing phenomena that would happen in certain Maya tribes, where when soldiers came back from war and came back from killing, they weren't allowed back into the community right away. They had to be healed first.
mm,
And that parallel inside ourselves is, I think, what you're talking about. The perpetrator inside each of us. And
mm,
and I'm like, this is the place you're gonna go during birth.
mm,
Like your mom, your dad, your first
mm,
partner, your all the things you've ever done to someone else. You know, it's churning that space. And I mean, you know, I got told when I was like 20 by one of my teachers that before someone has a child, they really have to do their own emotional work. Otherwise, it's all coming up. So I'm curious what stirs for you. We've gone very wide and now we're coming down to like the individual again.
yeah, yeah. I don't know. Thank you, thank you. And in terms of birth, I just feel like I am, hopefully my intention is, I am just increasingly humble. I bow in humility in the altar of birth. I don't, the more I do, the less I have prescribed ideas about what people should or shouldn't do, or how they can prepare themselves or not prepare themselves, or what comes up or what doesn't come up. It's such a mix of physiology and universe and emotion and the baby, and who knows. I mean, what I definitely do see though is, or what my invitation is and what birth can offer, is an invitation into one's own wild. And I think perpetrator, perpetrated, I don't know if that comes up, but that, there's so much wildness in our bodies. There's so much. And I think a lot of us are afraid of that. We've been shamed out of it, or cultural, our culture has dimmed us out of that, or we've been colonized out of it, or yeah, so I think all that can be there. But actually, when someone's able to really drop into their own wild, and sometimes the birth will take them on the journey, sometimes they're able to drop there themselves, there's so much power that they can reference to at any time. And I think even if people haven't given birth, or for men, that capacity or that space or that opportunity to meet one's own wild, I mean, it's terrifying, but it's also so powerful. So I don't know if I've really answered your question correctly, but
I don't know
that's
that there's a singular answer, but what's so strong in what you're saying and what my heart is responding to is when we speak about the harms of of this time, of the last 1,000 years or so, has really been robbing people of their wildness and a systematic disconnection from the earth for whatever, like for resources, for land, whatever was the motivation. I don't know. I wasn't those people. I wasn't there, but it feels like what's happening now is this incredible longing in the hearts of human beings to go back towards that way of being in whatever way they can. And some people are very blessed that they are closer to their ancestral origins, so there's a pathway. I think, my heart just like bleeds so much because I meet so many people who are like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where I came from. I don't know who my ancestors are, but there's this like deep longing to just be living in a way that's different, And so much of this work and so much of what Donna Lihio handed Rosita and the stories she's told about him and what comes in dreams for people who come to this work is really just this welcoming invitation into a way of being, not into taking someone else's culture, but into a way of being that respects the sentience of the living world and I guess, like, I'm looking for a word, the companionship of like the living world, the companionship of the elements, the companionship of plants, the companionship of the body, so that you're not alone. And it's really like it's aloneness at the end of the day that's being healed. So I'll stop talking. I'll let you jump in.
No, that was beautiful. And I think, I agree. I think there's an aloneness that happens from each other, from humans, from deep intimacy, from a deep heart space. I think there can be an aloneness that happens when we separate from spirit. And there's an aloneness that happens when we separate from earth. And there's an aloneness that happens when we separate from our own bodies. Our bodies are earth. Our bodies are not, and we are not good or bad or separate from, we are earth. And yeah, I think that aloneness can happen on many levels. And I suppose it's that each individual can, it's like I'm always into ease. So where do you start with the path of ease back into connection? And what's your most easy path? Is it with human? Is it with your own body? Is it to spirit? Is it to earth? Where is your path of ease to start to open into connection? Isn't it curious? We become more and more, disconnection. I think it's like swings back around to what you were talking about in the beginning around sensitivity, because within sensitivity there's capacity for empathy, and within empathy there's capacity for connection. And what we know from science of the nervous system is when we're in flight or fright or freeze, when we're in our like it's ventral vagal, where we can be in connection, where our mirror neurons work, where we have the capacity for empathy. And when we're not in that, we lose our capacity for empathy. So, a way to start with how to come back in connection is, how do I downregulate myself? How do I support myself when, with what's happening externally, I'm in this constant flight response, or I'm in a constant fight response, or I'm in deep freeze? How do I can see why people feel alone. If you're in deep freeze, how do you mobilize to be able to come out so that your nervous system is settled and your vagus nerve is in a space of being able to connect? And what is it that helps us? Is it prayer? Is it movement? Is it others? Is it touch? What helps us? Again, for me, it comes back to movement. What helps us mobilize?
Yeah, it does. It does come back to movement again. It's what you were speaking about before. And also, through this whole conversation, a seed that's been consistently replaying is none of this is really possible from a place of judgment,
No.
And so it's almost like, where do you put the sweet little judgment that arises in each of us? Like, it has to be given a place to live. So it's not coloring, shifting, influencing this process, because otherwise it naturally puts a brake on all the places you want to go. So judgment could be great for
Mm.
measuring out a recipe or used in a cognitive way somewhere else. But it's almost like if the invitation were that, what if I just don't judge myself as I explore my body and my relationship to all things and what arises in me and the pain and the pleasure? It's like, what if judgment wasn't part of that equation? Where would I go?
Yeah, totally. And even if there is a judgment, my question would be, what sits underneath that? What need is not being met? Even if we're judging others, like, wow, you're being so harsh, I is it that I have a need for sensitivity? Or wow, you're being so like totalitarian, and is it that I have a need for autonomy? So if there is judgment, and particularly with others or ourselves, what's the need that's not being met underneath that? Yeah.
There's like, I could talk to you for hours and hours and hours and hours. So rich. Thank you. Thank you. Um, my curiosity is, how can people connect with you? What, you said that there's some online offerings, there's offerings in person. Would you love to share them?
Oh, thank you so much. Yes. So I have a website, Claire Eccleston, midwife.com, and that's Eccleston. And I'm on Facebook as Claire Eccleston, and I'm on Instagram as Claire Homebirth. And there's Bringing Birth Back Home, which is an online workshop for building confidence in home birth, and Holy Ground, which is for the preparation and repair of vaginas and vulvas and yonis at any time before and after birth. And I do Zoom sessions with people. I had a session yesterday with someone in America. And amazing, like you said before, how much can happen on Zoom. And I do one-to-one spinning babies, inspired body work, craniosacral internal work. That's in Auckland. And I teach around the country and overseas as well. So my website's probably the best way, and there's a contact form on there. So it's Claire, www.claire, Claire, Eccleston, midwife.com.
I'm so excited. Thank you. I'm going to go check that out soon. Is there a blessing or a final kind of thought or wisdom that you'd love to share with your listeners?
Yeah, the blessing is that may you find the path to pleasure in your beautiful and most powerful pelvis. May that path be easeful. May there be deep ease in how you connect with the pleasures of your body.
Mm, thank you. Thank you.